Right, let's get started. How hungover are we? No, we're okay. You didn't drink much yesterday. Right. Look, the topic is not going to be anything new for most people. But what I wanted to do was talk a little bit about the importance of bridging that gap between IT operations, the people that are on the ground actually executing all of the stuff that we need them to do from a security perspective, and security itself. So, not going to go too much into the agenda, but really just talking a little bit about the complexity of environments. Whose problem is it anyway, in terms of who's doing what, and which teams are responsible for what. And we're going to look a little bit at a more holistic approach to infrastructure security and compliance. This is the part that I hate the most. It's a bit about me. I've been around the block for a while. I've worked for most of the large vendors over the years, and I'm currently with Runecast, and I'm effectively the product guy, right? So I do everything in relation to product, falls to me. So when we think about today's environment, right? I mean, again, this is not new for anyone in the audience, or at least I hope it's not, right? We've got a fair mix of different types of architectures, right? You've got your more general on-prem, I'm not going to call it legacy, because people tend to hate me for using the word legacy, but more on-prem related tech, right? We generally or very often have at least some form of a cloud deployment, maybe not mission critical yet, but we definitely start going that way. We might even have started doing multi-cloud, right, depending. And then you start adding things like containerized deployments, Kubernetes or Tanzu or any sort of Kubernetes flavor, if you will. Which is it's great for business growth, it's great for being able to adapt to new tech. It's really, really bad for security, compliance and things like that, because you end up with a fair mix of different technologies. Very often it means you need 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 different products. Of course I'm biased, right? I work for one of the vendors. But I've also seen it on the other side, right? And it's really difficult to make sure that, let's say when we start thinking about compliance, for example, you have one compliance standard that you need to comply with. But generally that means you need to comply with that standard across your entire tech stack. It's not going to be different for Kubernetes than it is for, let's say, VMware, or it's not going to be different for any sort of operating system deployment as it is for your AWS EKS. The standard remains the same, but the problem is, in a lot of cases, from a vendor perspective, we've been really, really good at inventing new point products. I've been in the industry for 20 years. The one thing we've been really good at was inventing new products. There's always a new point product that we can sell you. There's always a new point product that we can use. But what it means in the end is that you end up with 5, 6 different teams and a whole load of different products that you need to run in order to get anywhere near full coverage of what you actually need to cover, right? And I think we probably can all agree that's not the most efficient way of doing things. It creates a lot of problems, right? It creates risk of having blind spots. You'll run around and you might not see everything that you think you need to see, right? So really, complexity is not necessarily the friend of good teamwork, but whose problem is it anyway, right? And excuse the liberal use of memes and GIFs. I thought, on the last day we can use with a little bit more lighthearted. But yeah, whose problem is it anyway, right? I mean, if we're looking at it from a security perspective, well, ultimately it's our problem. But who's gonna do the work? Who's gonna, look after the patching? Who's gonna run the compliance scans? Who's gonna make the changes on the systems? In a lot of cases, it's not the security team. It's not the SOC team. It's, usually it's the infrastructure team. And we're usually the ones that are breathing down the infrastructure team's neck and say, here's a list of things, go fix it, right? And that's basically, in a nutshell, the topic that I want to talk about, right? Because it's very easy for us from a security perspective to think about We've already got the first person yawning, that's not good. When we think about how we go about doing, for example, continuous compliance, or when we think about how we go about doing continuous vulnerability assessment, we think about this purely from a security perspective, which is great. It does not necessarily take into account the process that comes after me making a decision that we need to be at a certain patch level or we need to be compliant with a certain standard. It does not take that into account whatsoever, how we actually going to get there, right? And so when we think of all of the different areas, we've got vulnerability management, we've got troubleshooting, compliance, upgrade planning, all of the things that, again, when we think about security and compliance, especially from an infrastructure perspective, there is business continuity in there as well, right? Because we've got to make sure that even if we have, let's say, an environment that's free of vulnerabilities, it's still got to be able to run, right? It's not going to do us any good if it goes dark and it's not running anymore, right? So business continuity in this context, in terms of keeping systems well configured, following general best practices on how to deploy. It doesn't matter whether it's VMware based or AWS, GCP or anything else. All of these things fall into when we think about security from a more holistic approach, right? Because I can do as much as I want on the vulnerability side. If my environments aren't configured right and I can take them down with a simple DDoS, then my non-vulnerable systems aren't going to be any good, right? So there's a lot of additional things, obviously, that we need to take into account. When we think about all of these, you'll start to see that in a lot of cases, there's way more than just the security team or the SOC team involved. Of course, the SOC team is usually at the end of the chain. That's where we deal with all of the alerts, all of the things that will be presented. But usually when you look across these, you'll see there's quite a lot of, I guess, IT infrastructure involved in this, right? So again, when we use the same, but we just break it into the different teams. We've got all of our different teams. We've got our SecOps team. We've got our CISO, our risk teams. We've got our external auditors and our DevSecOps, our IT operations teams. All of these different teams will touch that workflow in one way or another. The problem is, whenever I speak to larger companies, or whether that's existing customers or industry, very often there's no connection between, from a tooling perspective, between what security does and what IT operations does. So you've got, on one side, you've got security that tells you, here you go, here's your very long list, these are all of the things that you need to fix, and you give that to them and say, go fix it. But there is no real connection between the two, that both ends are able to look at what needs fixing or what needs changing in one centralized place. So what's going to happen usually is, I'm going to take that personal.
Sorry.
No, you're fine, don't worry. I'm just giving you a hard side. What happens often is the fact that you end up with things that are either forgotten, processes aren't working well, even all the way down to metrics and reporting not being the same, right? Almost not speaking the same language. You have multiple different things that you look at, and you have multiple different teams that try to do bits in the process, but not with the same tool sets and not using necessarily the same language. I'm using air quotes, right? That's really challenging. So, quick question into the room. So in terms of what's the experience level when it comes to having to deal with various different teams when it comes to infrastructure? Do we have, so what's the mix? Who's on the end user side and who's on the partner side? End user side, okay, raise your hands. All right, okay, we've got a few. So let me ask, what does it look like in your environment? How does that information flow work from the security team to the infrastructure team? I'm going to ask you, sorry. Directly?
I think this is the best one and the fastest.
Yeah.
And also effective.
Directly in what way? In terms of work order or in terms of, hey,
It depends on the partner. So
yep,
as they discussed and signed into contract with SLA.
right, so it's outsourced then in that sense?
Not exactly, but my experience, if it's not any punishment, it doesn't work.
Yeah, that's very true. But yeah, internally in a lot of cases, yes, direct communication it obviously works the best, but it's hard to track, right? It's really hard to track whether something has been done or not. And I know we spoke about this earlier. So yeah, I mean, it's really difficult to track these things. And especially when you start thinking about, let's assume you have, I don't know, a virtualized estate with 2,000, 5,000 VMs, endpoints, managed by various different teams across different sites. It's going to get really, really difficult to really keep track of where you are in terms of whether that's vulnerability assessment, whether that's compliance assessment, things like that, right? It's really difficult. So when we look at all of the different areas, right? So compliance management, vulnerability assessment, container security, configuration management, all of these things, I think we can all agree on is part of security, right? When we look at upgrade planning and troubleshooting, in a lot of cases, the initial response is that has nothing to do with security, right? But again, going back to the point I was making earlier on, if my stuff fails, it's no good, right? If I have potentially risky upgrades that could potentially jeopardize the environment, it's no good, right? So in a lot of cases, it's still the same environment, it's still the same people who look at it. They just do different bits of the workflow at that point, right?
Oh, sorry, I have to
Yes.
ask you this.
Yeah.
ISO tells us, ISMS tells
Yeah.
us that we have to care about CIA.
Yep.
In Europe also we care about privacy.
Yes.
So why is it a question that we have to take care of availability? That is the core business.
Yeah, no. I'm not saying availability in this context. It's more around if you do upgrading and you have bad firmware, things like that, right? It's not availability. Yeah. It's not availability in that sense. No. I don't think there's any regulation that wants you, from a security perspective, to care about availability. Right? It's more from a workflow perspective when it comes to doing upgrades on firmware level, things like that. Especially when you talk about virtualized environments, where if you make upgrades to firmware level, you might risk the entire environment, right? And obviously you want to.
Isn't that part of change management?
Yeah.
Provide according to it.
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. The point I'm making is those are usually the same people.
Sorry.
Right? The same people who will, let's say, do the patching of normal workloads or make changes to the configuration because there's, whether it's compliance concerns, security concerns, are the very same people who are the people that are responsible for running the upgrades and making sure that, you follow the change management rules that you have applied within your organization, right? So those are usually the very same people. But often those two things are very different processes, right? And they're not using the same tools, the same information. And when you then start, and we're only now talking about on-premises, right? We're not talking about you add cloud-based workloads, you add containerized workloads. So it gets quite complex, quite big, right? That's the main idea behind this. Oh, that was a little bit too quick. But yeah, I think there's a couple of stats, and I don't want to bore anyone with statistics, but on average, I think we're right now in the industry we're using somewhere around 11 different security tool sets per environment on average. Right? It's quite a lot. And there's probably some companies that use way more.
Sorry, but I'm laughing because there they said in average it's 44.
Yeah, no, I don't believe that. I'm sorry. Nothing against Pantera. But look, the problem with those statistics is always, it depends on who you want to believe, right? I used to have a boss many years ago who kept saying, never trust a statistic that you haven't checked yourself. And I think that's very true because they're all in one way or another. You know, you kind of have to take with a big grain of salt, right? But even if it's somewhere in the middle, right? Or even if it's just 10, I think that's probably 9 too many, right? Because, you know, adding more tools into the workflow has never made a problem easier. I think we can all agree to that, right? You know, adding just additional tool sets into your workflow, into the chain, has never made anything easier. It generally makes it more complex, right? It might solve the problem. I'm not arguing that fact at all, right? But a question that I think we all need to ask ourselves is, why do we have that problem, and why are we thinking about adding more tools? Are there other ways, right, of solving that problem? And of course, there's my funny little duck. But again, when we start thinking about this and of course I'm here from the vendor side, so I'm obligated to start pitching as well, just joking, but I will bring up Runecast just simply because of the fact that this is what we started out with. And this is not something that we kind of came up with, right? This is a problem that has been around for many years, in the sense that when we start thinking about security as a process, and yes, compliance as well to a degree, but when we think about the workflow as a process, it usually involves the same people. It involves the infrastructure team, it involves the operations team, it involves the security team, and depending on the size of your organization, it might involve the SOC team, and maybe some specialized teams as well. But it always involves the same set of people. They're all looking at the same infrastructure, they're all looking at the same data points, the same workloads. So it ought to make sense to give those teams one place that they can look at, exchange notes, if you will, on those workloads, and do all of the required tasks. Even if we leave out things like troubleshooting up, even if we leave that out altogether, if we just take the first 4, right? Wouldn't it make sense to have those in one place, regardless of your tech stack, right? So whether you have virtualized environments, or whether you have cloud environments, or you have containerized environments, or you've got a funny mix of all of them, I mean, quite honestly, wouldn't it make sense to have your teams be able to do that through one place rather than needing 4 or 5, right? That was the baseline question that basically we asked ourselves, and obviously we were asked by customers as well. And that's basically how kind of Runecast came to bring all of these into one. We initially started out in the IT operations space, right? So 8 years ago, we started out in IT operations. We did most of the general best practices and things like that. And over time, all of the additional functionalities came on top of that because of customer asks and industry asks. Because it's the same people, right? I keep using the term it's the same people because it's the same teams who do all of that work. And of course, it makes sense for the people that do the work to have one place they can basically log into and do all of the different parts of their jobs, right? And this is a bit of an overview in terms of what Runecast actually does, right? So, you know, and I was talking a lot about the abstracts of the different teams and the different parts of the workflow, but in terms of what that translates to is quite straightforward. It's basically you're looking at achieving a continuous compliance on vulnerability assessment. Yeah, I missed that away, so you can take a picture. Basically, you're looking at continuous compliance and continuous vulnerability assessment across all of the tech stacks. So again, going back to the point of really, you don't want to have a different solution for your different tech stacks, right? Irrespective of course, like I said, being very, very honest, of course I'm biased, I work there, right? But I've also been around for a while, and you don't want to have to deal with multiple different tools for different technologies because they're never the same, they never report the same way, they never talk to each other. You're never going to get really good workflows across different tool sets. It's always going to be cobbled together. No matter what we as vendors tell you, it's always going to be cobbled together, right? So really what you want to achieve is to get to a point where you can have all of your infrastructure security in one place, right? So that's your configuration drift management, that's your vulnerability assessment, that's your compliance, all in one place, no matter what tech you're using, right? And it allows you to do stuff like, getting to a point of continuous compliance. So you don't want to, my original background, way back when, is I came from the GSE space. So I used to be in banking, sitting on the other side of the table, purchasing software for compliance. And back then, it was a case of you were compliant, maybe if you were lucky, around 6 weeks around the time of auditing, because you had to. Every other time of the year, as long as nobody came knocking and asking, you were hoping quite a lot that there wouldn't be anything that you find. Today, obviously, we have a different approach to that, but we're still lacking behind in achieving continuous compliance, right? So you're still running basically after the time and try to figure out how you can make sure you have a compliance report by the time you get audited, whether that's self-audit or whether that's someone actually doing it. And what you want to do is you want to be able to do that across your entire environment. And you want to be able to do that continuously, every day, without anyone having to do anything manually, right? Because you really want to get your teams to spend the time on way more critical things than running compliance reporting or running simple, straightforward vulnerability assessment reporting, right? So this is basically what Runecast provides, right? It provides a way to do continuous compliance, continuous vulnerability assessment, configuration drift management, and container security, basically in one place. So all of your teams can use the same tool set, see the same information, can share the same information, and spend way less time on a lot of these steps than you would see if either it would have to be manually, and you'd be surprised, I can't name obviously the institution, but I was speaking to a very, very large banking auditing institution a while back, and when they go in and do audits, they use spreadsheets. Okay, right? Yeah. So, and you really want to kind of get away. The point is, you want to get away from that, right? I love spreadsheets as much as the next guy, but you really want to get away from using spreadsheets for that sort of thing, because it's not efficient. It really, really isn't, right? So, you want to get to a point where you can do this without actually spending any human time on it, or at least as little as possible. Same goes for vulnerability assessment. You want to be able to have risk-based prioritization. There's a lot of noise, right? I mean, there's 180 plus thousand CVs. There's a lot of noise. A lot of these are, I normally call them academic, right? You can abuse them, but you'd have to be physically in front of the server, do a handstand and type with your right foot. It's a vulnerability that can be abused, yes, but what's the real risk to you? And in a lot of cases, standard vulnerability assessment isn't going to give you much. It's going to look at the software package. Do you have it installed? Do you have the patch installed? Yes or no? If no, well, there you go. You won. Thank you very much. Whether you fulfill any of the other criteria that's required to actually exploit that vulnerability or not, in a lot of cases, you don't really get that information. So you end up with a very long list of potential things that you need to look at. Again, you're spending a lot of human time on wading through a lot of noise. And really what you want to get to is reducing that noise and being able to do risk-based prioritization, right? Just knowing what's the biggest risk, start working top down and addressing those things, right? I think I'm getting towards, I am at the dot. So that's me pretty much done with the presentation. I normally like to have questions, so if you have any, now would be a good time. Other than that, I also know it's already the second day of the of the event, and yesterday was probably a little late for some. So I'm not going to take it personal if nobody has any questions. But let me ask one question: did that make sense? Jesus Christ! I normally get a better response. No, but just the
It
concept.
makes sense
Yeah.
because you have an weapon, and you say these 5 people are seeing it from each perspective.
Yeah.
But at the end of the day, if you don't look at it from separate perspectives, you won't be able to see the whole element.
Yeah.
So you have to look at it from different perspectives.
Absolutely.
So when you go together, you will lose one of these things of regularity at least.
You don't. I would argue that. No, because I know what you mean, and I agree. I agree that obviously you want to be able to have segregation of duties and be able to have different. Absolutely, not disagreeing. But that does not have to translate into using entirely different tool sets. That can translate into role segregations based on the same baseline information, but using the same tech, the same tool sets, because if you don't, you'll end up with one team having basically to translate their findings into what the other team can understand, because usually it's different. You don't get the same reporting, things like that. So yeah, I totally agree in terms of don't throw it all together and just look at it from 30,000 foot. That's not going to work. You need that granularity, absolutely. But that doesn't have to translate into it needs to be completely different tools, right? I also understand the point that you don't want to always put all of your eggs into one basket. There needs to be, absolutely, yeah. But yeah, no, that's a good point. I think we're getting kicked out. Anyone else? No? Going once? Going twice? No? All right. Thanks everyone, and I hope you enjoyed.